People like games.
What's up, people, and welcome back to the show. I got a very cool guest joining us on People Like Games today. Translator, localizer, writer, and author, Matt Alt. Welcome to the show. He is
Thanks for having me.
Of course. He's the author of Pure Invention, How Japan Made the Modern World. This book was amazing. I really enjoyed it. There is not really, I think, anything like it because there's very few sort of historical, sociological, and semi-anthropological analyses of the culture of Japanese culture, especially as it's so dominant here in the US in the form of, as we are in gaming, so everybody already knows. So thank you for coming to the show. And these usually have like that awkward intro period of finding a topic. Right. So I like to ask people right away, what game are you playing right now?
Oh man, here's the funny thing. I actually don't game anymore. I literally do not have the time. So like when I'm playing a game, I'm usually picking up like my old Game Boy and playing through like an old Castlevania title or like Super Mario World or something like that. Or I got the Game and Watch of the Super Mario Brothers that I was playing through. But modern gaming, in spite of the fact that I ostensibly work in the localization industry, I just literally don't have time.
That's a recurring theme of everyone in gaming that I've interviewed, which is we don't really have time to game because when you're working in it, you sort of stay abreast of the developments, etc. But is there any games in the last few years that have burst that bubble and gotten you to sort of sit down and pick it up?
Well, I mean, my biggest one of the last couple of years was Death Stranding, like Hideo Kojima's Death Stranding, and like Kojima is a kind of character unto himself, right? He's this kind of bigger than life person, and very self-hyping, self-marketing, and so I was a little bit, honestly, suspicious when this new title came out, but it's just so weird. It's like
I haven't played it and I know everything about it, and I didn't get it, but like
it's a package. It's a package delivering simulator. It's basically like FedEx. I was gonna say. It's like FedEx in the apocalypse. It's like, but it's great. Like the music, like I think the thing I like about it most, I mean, putting aside gameplay or like design or anything like that, is that it all kind of comes out of his fevered imagination. Like there's no focus testing. There's no like, do you think you would like? No, he's like, I don't care. I'm going to make some crazy ass thing that I love. And you're going to play it.
There's beauty to that because it's like, as you said, it's almost inseparable, which is like, you're just taking it as a package deal with how Kojima works. And if that's not your style, then you can't really criticize the game on a different set of merits. And so
no, definitely. And it's also, I think, almost a throwback to the way games used to be made. I mean, back in like the 70s and 80s, it was like one dude, usually a dude, sometimes a woman. But usually a dude making a game like in on their desk, you know what I mean? Coding it. And now, of course, you have teams of like 500 people making games. You have to. It's the only way to make them.
It's curious. So then now, does your sort of like gaming experience change being in Japan? Because I look at this through a US-centric version, right? And so for me, like the Xbox, PlayStation thing is more of a debate than it would be, say, in Japan, where Xbox is now just growing. So like, for the titles that are sort of popular and did Hi-Fi Rush, which is a new game, like do they cross do they cross your day-to-day, or is it primarily a specific type?
So no, I mean, the way it worked, my company, Alt Japan, we founded it 20 years ago and as a localization firm. And like back in the late 90s when we started working, the only games to localize were console games. Console titles. And now like there's just been this huge rise and explosion over the last 5 years or so of indie games. And like we don't really do console titles anymore. Console titles are the minority compared to all sorts of, Steam, Direct, going cross-platform, like whatever. But, in Japan, I don't think the console wars are a thing. Like they never were to the degree that they were in the States. Like maybe in like the 90s, you had like PC Engine versus like Sega, Mega Drive kind of stuff going on. But now it's just everything's shifted to basically smartphones. And like the average game that the average gamer is playing is some kind of like gotcha thing on their smartphone.
So like Sony and Nintendo having like a particular just dominant market share that's unquestioned. I'm surprised. I wouldn't have expected Japan to be. I know Asia is primarily a mobile gaming.
And that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
I don't think I mean, if you're talking like, you throw a dart and hit a Japanese house, right? People are probably either playing mobile or they're playing like they're playing the Switch.
Yeah.
Most houses that I've gone to, friends, like everybody has a Switch.
Yeah.
And like the Switch is so cross generational. You'll see a 9-year-old with a Switch and you'll see like a 39-year-old with a Switch. You don't see that so much with a PlayStation 5. Like you have to really be motivated to go out and get a PlayStation 5 or like a VR rig.
100%. Like the Switch is like the perfection. See, okay, so now we have to take this in a sooner version than I expected, but I wanted to talk about someone who's very near and dear to my heart, Gunpei Yokoi. And
okay.
So funny enough, I saw you had written an article on him, which made me really happy. I'm a big proponent of him. And I think of the Switch and I think of the idea of like opening up gaming for more people and that idea, right? And so is Japan more like games oriented versus like graphics oriented? Because like Final Fantasy made it seem like Final Fantasy was the thing in the 90s, but since then it's been almost 20 years.
Well, Pure Invention, How Japan Made the Modern World, the book that I wrote and it came out a year or so ago, is all about how the Japan basically resurrected itself after World War II through the power of play, through toys. The very first chapter deals with making toys out of literal garbage, as there was no material around. So Japanese toy makers had to fashion tin cars and stuff out of junk that they scavenged from the American military bases. But that led to this huge toy industry coming up. And actually, the way I think, especially in our generations, like when you start from like Generation X, millennials, zillennials, the way that we interact with Japan is through playthings, various kinds of playthings, whether it's a video game system, whether it's actual toys, whether it's Pokemon cards, whether it's anime. These are all like leisure play oriented types of activities. And Gunpei Yokoi, who was Nintendo's first kind of genius engineer in the post-war era, because Nintendo has a huge history. Like they started like in the 1880s, as I'm sure people who follow this podcast know, and were making another form of plaything, Hanafuda, traditional playing cards for many, many, many decades until in the 1960s, when President Yamauchi took over and started taking the company into sometimes some really bizarre directions. But they really hit their stride when Gunpei Yokoi came on board. And he was just this Kyoto-based engineering guy. He wasn't particularly ambitious. He didn't want to change the world or anything like that. He just wanted to make stuff, and he wanted to like work near his home in Kyoto. And Nintendo was just hiring at that time, and they weren't this giant like multimedia, massive, rival of Disney concern. They were this little like crappy Kyoto company making cards.
Yeah, absolutely. So, they've evolved now. So like taking that idea of like the Switch, right? It became almost like the Wii in the sense that like the Satoru Iwata, that's where the Gunpei idea came in of like expanding the market of gaming to everybody.
Yes.
And seeing.
And I think Gunpei Yokoi's, he wasn't a programmer.
No.
He wasn't a gamer, but he had this huge influence on Nintendo's development as a game company because he was a toy maker. Like he made physical toys, like stuff. And then when electronics started to get incorporated into toys in the early 70s, he incorporated those into his toys. So like he made these kind of light gun games that are the precursors to the light gun video games that you see now, where you'd actually shoot the light gun at a physical object and it would fall over. Things like that. Yeah, no, it's great stuff. So Gunpei Yokoi, I think the reason Nintendo grew into the big company that it did was because he had one foot in the analog material world of like physical play, how kids play with stuff, and then one foot in this new growing digital world. And he and Miyamoto brought that into games.
But how come he is not as, and the reason I wanted to bring this up right away, because you're the first person I met who I can have a Gunpei Yokoi combo with. How come he's so underappreciated in terms of when you look at the legacy and history of Nintendo? Miyamoto is right there, but it's almost like if there was a picture, he Back to the Future disappeared from the narrative of, or at least a modern narrative of how Nintendo became this.
Well, I think it's because he literally disappeared. Unfortunately, Yokoi died in 1997, very young, or tragically young. I think he was like in his late 50s at the time. he was hit by a car on the expressway. It was just a freak traffic accident, and he died.
Yeah.
And he died just as he had left Nintendo. It wasn't acrimonious, but it wasn't harmonious either. Like he left to found Wonder Swan, like and start like go off in his own direction without
sort of Game Boy clone.
Yeah. I mean, well, at that time,
just for in terms of the history. So like just like even in your book, like we'll get to it, like Miyamoto is really seen as the person who helped establish Nintendo. But I'm like, I just always feel like Yokoi is like a forgotten name in history.
Yeah,
and celebrated even by Nintendo itself.
Yokoi even says that himself. There's a biography, an autobiography. It's kind of co-authored with somebody, so I don't know if it's an autobiography exactly, but it's called like Yokoi Gunpei's House of Games, and it really needs to get translated into English. It's the book about his life, and it's based on extensive interviews with him. And in that book, it was revealed that he's the one who came up with like the core gameplay for Donkey Kong.
Yeah.
And a lot of other Nintendo games, like, it was he who suggested making a game based off Popeye.
Yeah.
And then kind of tasked Miyamoto with it. And he's very clear in the book that he's like, I'm not trying to take credit. I'm not like I don't care. I want to see awesome products get made in the marketplace. Yeah. So he was never kind of a self-marketer. He was never like an influencer.
Yeah.
From that standpoint,
yeah.
He was someone who kind of was content working in the shadow, not in the shadows, but like, behind the scenes. Like he was the puppet master, so to speak, of Nintendo.
And it always reminds, because whenever I think of anything Nintendo related from the Switch, especially because it's really taken that idea of like, you don't have to technologically compete at the cutting edge. You can sort of reformulate the tech and it'll still work. But
yes,
actually, now we're going to shift a little bit so I can keep you focused.
Sure.
On the actual book, because
please.
I thought, just the idea of Japan's cultural influence is interesting because I've always wondered how it was tied to the post-World War II sort of environment and atmosphere and how that sort of fueled it. And so I guess, now, many years later, I guess the first question would be, what is the appeal of Japan to the West? As sort of like a basic thing of,
Yeah. I mean, well, Japan has always been this kind of canvas for the West to project its own fantasies and dreams on, like almost from the moments of first contact in the 1850s. Japan was seen as this sealed kingdom that had like opened up to the world and was full of treasures that like we could never have imagined. And so like when, back then Japan was a pre-modern feudal, country. So its economy was driven by handicrafts. And when those hit the Western marketplace, it just blew people's minds, like woodblock prints and like China ware and like, accessories and accoutrements. And it literally, Japanese stuff shifted the meaning of what sophistication meant in the West. Like, Tiffany's rejiggered itself around a Japanese motif, like which most people don't know today. Like all of their early stuff in the late 1800s was based on hokusai. The Impressionists are like incorporating Japanese woodblock prints into their work, like the stage, Gilbert and Sullivan, the Mikado, everything, all sorts of things are being influenced by this image of Japan. And that is actually where my book takes its title from. It's a quote by an Irish, London-based playwright called Oscar Wilde, who was working and active in the middle of this period of history, which is now known as Japanism, like this love for all things Japanese in the Victorian, and early.
I crossed over the Victorian.
Yeah. Period. Oh, it's Victorian, early Gilded era. We're talking like basically 1860s through about 1920 or so. And you had this just period where now cool Japan is a thing. It was a thing back then too. But Wilde noticed that most people were more fascinated by the idea of Japan than they were with Japan itself, which is why he said, Japan does not exist. Japanese people do not exist. It is a country of pure invention, by which he meant fiction. And he's like, if you really want to understand Japan, you should just go to your friend's house and look at ukiyo-e prints, and he was joking, of course, but it shows you how much Japan has kind of occupied our fantasies even back then. And then
Absolutely.
in our, like, this is the story of the book. I could keep talking about this for hours, but it's always kind of held a spell over us.
And that's what I say. I was like, do you still see now from that time period down to the 1800s of that sort of fantastical notion of Japan? Do you still? I think almost you could arguably say it's still held today of
Yes.
Japan as this sort of like quirky, sort of
Yeah.
futuristic like fantasy land, especially more so arguably today because
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
one of the things I was going to ask is like what like anime consumption here has become huge in the past couple of years, right? And so I was of the era of like Toonami and Dragon Ball Z, and so it's like those were the first sort of US based animes that were being translated and sort of brought
Right.
stateside.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
Market,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
to mainstream audience, right? And then now you have something like Crunchyroll and you have One Piece and Bagel. It's like, have you seen, or was it sort of obvious that sort of massive rise would take place at Netflix and all these places?
No. I don't think it was obvious. So, but I think it is really ironic that literally 100 years after Oscar Wilde wrote those words, basically the same thing is happening. It's not woodblock prints, it's anime, it's manga, and people read those and project their own kind of fantasies onto what Japan is. Because most manga and anime readers don't come to Japan. It's a long.
I was going to say.
So
they're daily interaction. It's a very specific type of content consumption, even from the culture. It's not even a wider cultural consumption, right?
Definitely. No, that's why. Well, in my book, I call them fantasy delivery devices. Japan, and this kind of links back to your original question, which is why we love stuff from Japan so much. Japan is really great at making fantasy delivery devices, which in the book I define as things that are inessential. Yeah, we don't need them. We want them, and we purchase them not out of a need, but because out of this burning desire. And the reason that Japanese are able to make things that stimulate this desire in people around the world is kind of twofold. One is that they have this huge history of illustrated and narrative entertainment. Mm-hmm. But another one is because Japan in the post-war era hit a lot of the kind of milestones of industrial economies before the West did. Like it had this huge boom. It went from zero to like the second biggest economy in the world by the 1960s. And then it started to become a post-industrial economy in the 90s. They had a huge crash, the bubble it's called. The economic bubble bursts. Japan becomes completely mired in recession. Its politicians are like, it's chaos. It's like its young people have kind of lost hope for their futures. It sounds a lot like us in the 2010s. Yes. And so the stuff that Japan made, especially in the 90s, kind of answered questions that we hadn't thought to ask yet. Like we hadn't gotten as lonely as the Japanese were. We hadn't gotten as desperate as Japanese young people were. And we didn't have this desire for kind of virtual escapes that they did at that time. We were all in 90s America. You would look at Japan as being a weird out. Oh my God, they're all texting on phones.
Yeah,
that's so, and they're taking pictures and putting them into Facebooks. Who would do that? Like we laughed at Japan.
We 100%.
So, but then we became Japan.
See, that's actually the article that led me to your book. It was in, I think, Aeon. It was called The Great Regression, and it was just on this specific topic.
Yes.
And I thought it was really interesting because it's still like, as you have the parallels of the Japanese lost decade, and for people who are listening might not know, in the 90s, Japanese economy tanked, stocks crashed, and the sort of system of working towards the future went away, sort of like more analogous, even from the 2010s, it almost felt like more, prescient for what today is like, with tech being a big place where that might be the version of a salaryman for a lot of people who are coming into the job sphere for the last few years. And with that switched over, I'm still curious why Japan still, so as we become more childish, why Japan has sort of a lock on that sort of cultural output, and we don't get interested in other countries' animation.
Well, I talk about this. I mean, Japan's anime and manga industry are incredibly well developed, probably arguably more so than other nations. And the reason for that, I mean, there's many reasons for that. One is, again, that they had this long history of narrative illustrated entertainment going back to like the 1700s. Mm-hmm. And there's never been a kind of, like illustrated entertainment has never been seen purely as kid stuff in Japan. I mean, there was pornographic woodblock prints back in the 1800s too. Do you know what I mean? Like it was, this is for people of all, ages and persuasions and stuff. So the idea that you could put words and images together on a page and appealed to people, not just kids, but adults as well, was, well alive, and it was very strong in Japan. And then in the post-war era, when like the entire, industrial infrastructure had been knocked down, the publishing industry was one of the first to come back online, and magazines and like at first rental comics were like a big thing. And like Japan has this reputation of being a very rigid society. Yeah. And maybe it is when you're talking about, etiquette and like, business and things like that. But in the sphere of manga in particular, it is completely unfettered and open. And like there hasn't ever been anything like the American Comics Code Authority or, of course, there's been like, movements to try to shut down, oh my God, this is too parents groups, whatever, the government. There's always been pushback. But like the manga industry has always been this kind of like realm of almost total free expression, whether it's for kids or whether it's for adults or whether it's mixed. Yeah. And that it's kind of this dark matter that's churning behind the scenes of Japan's pop cultural machine, because most of the big animated hits come from manga. Yeah.
But so from seeing that growth, say, in the country, right? Yeah. Has the growth globally, maybe say 5-year span, been in places outside the US as well? Are there any other countries? Because I always just look at the mass amount of mainstream anime consumption. So
it's huge.
Spain, Germany, and there's a few other countries.
The Arab world, there's the manga is huge in the Arab world. It's huge in South America, Central America, like things like Dragon Ball, Saint Seiya. I mean, these are massive hits in Central America and South America. Absolutely massive. And in the Arab world, you get a lot of the sports type things taking off, Slam Dunk, older ones like Captain Tsubasa, the soccer comic, because manga, because soccer is so popular over there, Brazil, and so it's not just a Western phenomenon. Like Japanese illustrated entertainment and I consider games part of that too, actually, even though they're digital, because they, especially in their earlier iterations in the 70s, in their 80s and 90s, borrowed heavily from manga. Yeah. 100%. And like before I ever read a Japanese manga, I learned about a lot of the conventions from games, kawaii characters or like power-ups or like, boss characters, things like that often come up in Japanese
JRPGs,
games.
A main genre of gaming is contributed directly to anime, and even like Akira Toriyama and Dragon Quest and coming together. And so it's funny. So that sort of overlap is always so curious to me, because in gaming and in anime, there was one part of the book that I really, really loved, which was a chapter about Gundam.
Right. Yes.
And so for the people who don't know, Gundam was the first anime that sort of really showed the power and actual depth of fandomship in anime in Japan. And it sort of, in your words, and I really love this, was when the tipping point of when anime consumption became a social identity. Right. And I'm curious, in your opinion, do you see a similar version of that in gaming? When did that, in your opinion, sort of become? Because I was looking for the analogs between anime and gaming, and consumption as an identity in anime is a big thing. Well, I'm gonna get to this question of that, but for gaming, what do you think would be sort of a tipping point?
I think gaming in Japan started as a purely adult activity. Like video games in Japan in the 70s were competing with pachinko, which is like a kind of form of gambling in Japan with these vertical pinball machines. And so like you can go back and find, I might have even included one in my book, pictures of invader rooms, which are nothing but Space Invaders cocktail. You go on a date there, like, it was an adult pastime. And I don't think gaming really even entered the kids sphere until the Nintendo Entertainment System came out. Like the Japanese government basically banned or tried to ban kids from going into arcades because they saw video game arcades as adult spaces. And they failed at this, but they did put regulations on that you couldn't be in as a kid after 8 p.m. And like you couldn't be wearing, like, there's all these like kind of regulate, and there were like PTA groups like intercepting kids, trying to prevent them from going to game arcades on the way home from school. So there was this society-wide like attempt to keep kids away from gaming that ironically coincided with the Famicom coming out, the Nintendo Entertainment System in Japan. And when that hit, and you could game in your house, suddenly every kid in the world had a Famicom, and gaming became the leisure activity for kids in Japan after school.
Yeah.
Almost overnight. This is like 82 or so, 83, right?
Mhm.
When Super Mario hit, it was like fuel on, like throwing gasoline on a fire. It was explosive to the point where like Super Mario Brothers, the strategy guide, was the best-selling book in Japan. Book, not like best-selling strategy guide. It was the best-selling book in Japan for like 2 years running, like 84, 85, I think. Like Haruki Murakami hasn't done that. Like J.K. Rowling, like Stephen King, they haven't done this.
Definitely.
You know, it's so like, it just goes to show you how much it swept Japanese society. And when those kids grew up, so like by the 90s, that I think is really when the idea that I am a gamer took root, because this is the first generation of kids who'd been basically raised on games since they were kids. And in America, I think it happened a little, in the West, I think it happened a little later. Of course, there were always people who saw, you know, gaming is kind of integral to their interests and their hobbies, but gaming becoming like a literal, like a genre, like a lifestyle. Yeah. I think that happened about a decade later in the West. About the but there was like, what was the tipping point? Maybe it was Final Fantasy VII. Like Final Fantasy VII is a game that came out and really pushed the boundaries of what a game could be. It's not just about, you know, twitch reflexes. It can tell a story, and it can tell a story in a stylish way that competes with, or even exceeds, arguably, a movie or an anime. Absolutely. You know, so that's why I opened my book with Final Fantasy VII. It was, I don't know if young gamers today who've only experienced it as a kind of retro thing and who have only experienced like massively online multiplayer, you know, like
the Fortnite era might not understand.
Exactly. It was a big thing when that game came out. We were even me who love Japanese stuff, I was like, holy shit, like what did these guys make? What is this? Like it was wild.
It was the cinematic nature of like Final Fantasy in America was just like the big Japanese PlayStation product coming with multiple discs. And then, you know, it's funny because you said, because either you were someone who were a Final Fantasy guy or gamer, or you weren't. And that's like sort of the first sort of divide of, do you like turn-based strategy games? And so,
well, and also, do you like the style of it? You know, it had the big anime hair. It had like the kind of like Bishonen, you know, kind of like effeminate, you know, protagonists, and like a lot of these things that we take for granted from Japanese manga and anime today. And like, if you had asked me in 97, who is going to be the biggest game company, you know, 10, 20, 30 years from now, I would have said Square. Like, I would have thought they would take over the world. It didn't play out that way for a variety of reasons. Nintendo took it over. And I mean,
I have a question about Square, and it'll relate to Japan and sort of in manga as well. Now Square Enix, it was a company that realized that Japan-only growth was no longer viable, right?
Yeah.
So now inherently, now we're looking outside. Does that inherently, and even manga, and that's why I asked, which is, as it gets bigger on a global scale, does it change the type of development being made? Like, are there Japanese gamers in society being like, man, why can't we make games like we used to here in Japan?
Sure.
You know, is that
well, I think those types go into indie gaming and make their own stuff, but like, I haven't been inside Square Enix in many years. I worked there as a contractor when my company did the localization of Dragon Quest VIII. So this shows you how long ago it was. So I don't know what's going on inside Square Enix right now. I do know they have a lot of foreign, like bilingual people working there. So it would shock me if you know, the foreign marketplace was not on their minds. But generally speaking, in Japan, foreign, and this often like really kind of upsets people abroad when they hear this, but I don't mean it in a disparaging way. They're not making it for you. Like, Japanese creators aren't really thinking outside of Japan. They're thinking about their own influences and domestic gamers, and they love it when foreign people play their stuff. They support it, like they're all for it, but they don't think about it ahead of time usually.
They're not trying to appeal to a market.
Exactly. And like, I think that's true. Like, Square Enix was overjoyed that they were being seen as like the tech leader around the world, but they weren't like, we'd better put in some, you know, characters to appeal to XYZ abroad.
That's what I was thinking.
And you know, that shouldn't be confused with some kind of anti-wokeism or something like that.
No,
It's not that either. It's just that Japan has always been kind of like a turtle in its shell. Do you know what I mean? It's been very insular. And actually, that's what we love about Japan. This leads into your original question, which is that it has an authenticity. Yeah. You know, because it's not being forced down our throats. You know, we have to kind of discover it. And through that path of discovery, it becomes part of our identity.
Yes, 100%. And so, funny enough, the other question I was asked is, how do people, because we were just talking about that the people in Japan Square, they celebrate when the game gets popular globally, etc. Over here, though, there's a bit of gatekeeping that occurs in the US when it comes to anime, right? Like, oh, wow, you're not really this sort of fan, or in gaming, you obviously probably have seen these aren't real gamers, and they have that sort of division. How does Japan and Japanese society view, say, the popularity of all anime and their cultural things in America, right? Do they see it and see, oh, wow, One Piece is huge in America, and just say, like, what is the reaction there to that?
I think pride. I think there's a lot of pride, you know, like a lot of like people all over the world, grown-ups who indulge in what were long believed to be childish proclivities, like whether you're like a diehard manga reader or watching anime or collecting action figures or still into Pokemon, even though you're like 40 years old. Yeah. There's a certain amount of insecurity there, even when you embrace your inner geek and let your freak flag fly. And, you know, by the way, by singling, I mean, I collect toys, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not like pointing any fingers here or anything, but, you know, there's often a lot of insecurity that, I'm seeing your back.
Exactly. Exactly. So we're not judging.
We're all, but like, so I think Japanese otaku, that's actually not really a word used in Japan anymore. We can get to that later. But what we would consider otaku, have a lot of pride in it, because it kind of validates that their, you know, interests have meaning outside of their own personal lives. So like, I do think there's a lot of that. And that, you know, now Japan knows that it's kind of anime and manga are a big part of its export strategy. When I first started coming to Japan in the 90s, early 90s, on like homestays and like study abroad programs, people were like blown away that I was interested in Japan because of manga or anime or games or Godzilla movies or whatever. They were just, they couldn't process it. They were like, what, why? You know, like everybody else is into like karate or like wants to study business. Why do you care about Gundam? Yeah. You know, but they rolled with it. Now it's like, if anybody, you know, I'll occasionally get asked, you know, well, why did you first get interested in Japan? And I'd be like, oh, you know, I really like Gundam, but it wasn't available in English. And people are like, oh yeah, right. You're okay. Of course you were into Gundam when you came to Japan. Yeah. So it's like, you know, I'm like, well, wait a second. It was rare back then. Okay. Yeah, it was rare. Now it's like it's flipped now. Like when I was studying Japanese in high school in the late 80s, early 90s and college, I was literally one of the only kids in class studying because of Japanese pop culture. Now it's flipped. Every Japanese student is studying and wants to be a game localizer, wants to be an animator, you know, and more power to them. Like whatever motivates you is great.
But I do see the same thing where I was like, you know, even the discovery of having to find the animes, and over here in the US of trying to find the actual things you want to watch, I think it's changed just the consumption habits to have that full access for a lot of people as well.
Part of me, not to sound like your grandpa who had to walk, you know, uphill to school both ways, but like, you know, when I was a kid, we had to hunt for this stuff and it wasn't even translated, you know. Exactly. But that was part of the hunt was part of it. And now I don't think young people know the hunt because they don't have to. Like, turn on the TV, you can see Demon Slayer the 30 seconds after it aired in Japan. I'm jealous. If I sound jealous, it's because I am. I
trust you.
I would have killed to have Gundam in English, but then a part of me wonders, like, I'm a lazy motherfucker, just like everybody else. It's like, would I have studied Japanese if I had it all served to me on a platter?
Which is where I'm like, does that change the relationship? Because someone like you sort of fell in love with the culture as well as the products, and I feel like a lot of people end up assuming the products are just the culture versus an aspect of it, right?
Well, I don't even blame them. I mean, if the only way you interact with Japan is through its products and not its people, of course you're going to get a kind of skewed image. And like, some people take it to the next level. I want to go there, you know? But it's, you know, it's like, I'm sure there's many people around the world who only know America through like Hollywood movies, and they probably have a very different idea, or like, you know, Call of Duty or whatever. And they probably like, if you only play Grand Theft Auto, which ironically isn't an American game, it's a British game. But if all you played was Grand Theft Auto, you probably have a pretty skewed image of what American cities are like. Drive on the sidewalk?
Would you though? Would you?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's the thing. Or maybe not. Maybe the Brits were really, you know, spot on.
No, if they had an idea, they're like, it looks like it's going that way. And we're like, what in the reality is this?
Well, maybe it's life imitating art. I don't know. There's often that.
Stranger than fiction. That's what that is. But so actually, so now you mentioned like even in terms of the characters getting big. So Japan over time, even through your book, I was looking at, there were big exporters of hardware, right? So there was record players, cars, et cetera, et cetera. But now with Disney, because now I want to circle back around to Disney being the biggest gaming company in the past 25, 30 years, because they have what is like the IP for the 21st century. And so they are sort of like the new Disney, because I'd argue more kids probably know Mario than they know Mickey.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly been the case in America for a very long time. You know, like in the 90s, that was the case. So, yeah, I mean, Japan has a really, really strong character culture. And like, you know, making hardware is not really where you want to be. It's extremely expensive. You don't make much money off of game consoles. The only reason to do it is if you can curate your own kind of walled garden of content, which Nintendo has successfully done.
Yeah.
But the real money is like, unless you're an industrial complex like Sony or something like that, or Microsoft, is IP. And like Japanese, I think Japanese, like that shift was happening way before video games came out. Arguably, I talk about this in the book, that shift started with Sanrio, the Hello Kitty company. And you might laugh when you hear that, but like the president of Sanrio, like around the early 70s, realized like, why are we manufacturing tote bags with cute characters on them? We should make the cute character and license that to people who make tote bags themselves. And that right there, that kind of like shift is basically the beginning of the modern era in a lot of ways. Sanrio doesn't make any of its products. It licenses Hello Kitty and Agretsuko and like all of these characters to other companies that do the hard work of actually making them. It's a smart place to be.
Which is what Disney, like that's where I see Nintendo with the Super Mario movie, Nintendo World sort of opening up the doors to that. And I look at it and I look at the kids and I say, when I was a kid and we were growing up, it was all Disney animated movies that were sort of created. So now with Mario, it's going to be a string of Nintendo movies. These characters are already reinforced through the games.
Yes.
Nintendo is Nintendo as much of a cultural behemoth as it is here for the user.
Oh, yeah. In Japan, absolutely. I mean, Splatoon is just giant. Splatoon 3 is, I mean, everybody plays Splatoon here. It's crazy. And
does everyone still play Pokemon? Because for some reason Pokemon has like a Simpsons level power hold here.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there was just a big article, or not an article, like a news program. There's a huge bubble for collectible cards right now where kids are actually being squeezed out because adults are like speculating. And these used card shops are doing a booming business in Pokemon cards, Yu-Gi-Oh cards, you know, even stuff like Magic the Gathering cards and things like that. And it's like, so yes, like Pokemon is definitely, I mean, Pokemon is just like now part of the cultural furniture, you know, like Mickey is in America, like, you know, whatever.
Pokemon is here too.
It's here to stay. And it certainly doesn't hurt that like in 2016, we had that huge boom of like Pokemon Go players.
Yes.
And so Pokemon Go is still really being played here by a lot of older folks. So like, to me, when I think of Pokemon, it's like really like there's kids who are actually playing Pokemon like they're quote unquote supposed to. And then there's like nostalgic adults who are still playing it because they just like it and they have fun. And then there's like elderly people for whom like a Pika what? And like, they just like having this app that forces them to get out of their houses and walk around and look for cute characters.
Interesting.
So you'll still see like kind of flash mobs of older people. I'm talking like middle-aged and up coming together because some rare, you know, Pokemon appeared on the corner next to the grocery store or whatever.
That's funny. That's a funny thing to see because 2016 was a great time period.
Oh yeah, I mean, it was a long time ago. It's hard to believe how long ago it was. It feels like it was just a couple years ago because we lost 3 years there.
I finally understand old people assuming everything was 10 years ago, because like everything was 10 years ago, and it's like, no, that's 20 now, and I'm like, no, that's shit, because
well, the secret, you know, I can shout this to the rafters, and it won't matter for people who are too young to grasp it, is that you in your mind, you never feel old. You're still the same age you always were, and it's the world that is getting weirder around you.
Yeah,
some people are better at dealing with that than others.
It's impossible to the young people listening to explain what that means and how true that statement is of, oh, you'll always feel, it's like, no, this is why time to feel stuck at that age, and everything is 10 years ago, because you just get older.
Well, you know, it's like relativity. You know, it's like Einstein's theory of relativity. You travel at light speed, and like time like stretches out and slows down. It's kind of like that getting older, because like, you know, when you were 16, a year was like, oh my God, that's a long time. Mm-hmm. Now, as like, you know, I'm 49 now. It's like it's a year is like snap your fingers and it's gone, because, you know, we're working on projects, you know, we're going out, meetings, dinners, gotta, you know, get the housework done, you know, like whatever. It's just because you're settled. Yeah. Well, also when you're 16, you're not settled. You know, when you're 20, 100%. You're not settled. When you're 30, you're not settled. You're still trying to figure things out. But, you know, especially by the time you get probably into your mid 30s to 40s, you're probably, whether you're settled in a sense like the boomer generation would have thought of being settled, you know, with a house and the picket fence and like 1.5 children and like 2 cats or whatever. Exactly. You're probably not settled like that, but you are probably in a groove, so to speak, you know, where like you know, when you're 17, like every day is like a new adventure. Yeah. You know, now when you're 37, not so much. So it's just how it goes.
I was thinking about this just because of the way like people think about school and stuff, and like how much more difficult it is to study when you're older, because you have a better concept of time and its passage than you do when you're younger. So when you're 17 or in college and you got to study, you'll stay up all night. Well, it doesn't matter. But when you're an adult, you're like aware of the time too much, like 3 days in a row to do that. Oof. Yeah. That's tough. As a kid, I'm like, today is the end of the day. We'll figure out what happens tomorrow.
Exactly. And I need my sleep. Do you know what I mean? It's like I had 2 beers and like I'm like, oh my God, like when you're 17 or like 20 or whatever, not that I would drink before I was 21 or whatever, but
depending on the country.
You know, exactly. You know, you can have 10 beers and be fine the next day. Now I have like 1 with dinner and I'm like,
yeah, exactly. I'm just like, I should have drank water with that one.
Exactly. Totally. I mean, it's just how it goes, you know, but here's the funny thing. I'd rather be here than not. The only way to like get frozen in time at a certain age is to die. So like, I'm really happy.
Every year is another year you got to be around, so it's never terrible when they add up.
Exactly, and I get to lord it over the kids. Like I knew Mario when he was just a knee high to a mushroom.
I was literally thinking about that before I talked to you. I was like, oh man, I'm a retro gamer. Like I remember PS1 era. I started, and then I was flipping through the book a little bit just again, and I was like reading about the arcade cabinets. And I'm like, oh man, there's someone from '83 looking at me, being like, you're a youngin', you don't understand games.
Yeah.
It's funny how the evolution.
Well, it's just funny. Like when I see like Stranger Things having like an episode set like in a game arcade, I'm like, oh man, wow. When I was a kid, I remember going to like see Back to the Future, and like I was like, why do movies always focus on the 1950s so much? Why do we care about the 50s? What? Yep. And now the exact same thing is happening with the 80s and 90s, and I'm just like, oh my God.
That 90s show being like, because at that one moment in time where people are like, oh, that 70s show is like, at a time like 20 years since, I was like, wait a second. Shit. This is how the 1980s? That was 20 years ago. It'll always be 20 years ago.
It'll always be 20 years ago. But more time has gone by since Back to the Future 1 to now than Marty McFly went back and forth in time.
Jesus Lord.
Way more real time has gone by. He only went back like 20 years. That movie is that movie is like 30 plus years old now. So and he jumped forward in time to 2015. It wasn't like
we're almost 10 years past Marty
We're like 4 years past Blade Runner. Blade Runner was set in 2019. We're 22 years past 2001: A Space Odyssey, not to mention Space 1999.
We're barreling right through those futuristic markers we find for ourselves.
Yeah, who knew the future would be this boring? Do you know what I mean? It's like I was expecting like Jetsons cars and like giant robots, you know.
I'm trying to remember. I think Blade Runner might have gotten it the most accurate. I was like, we're heading down the cyberpunk era. I think about that
for sure. William Gibson, I think. William Gibson's like cyberspace, like his cyberpunk trilogy, more than trilogy. I think there's like a quadrilogy in there. His books, like set in a really high-tech Japan, I think really capture a lot of what's going on now, even if we're not cyberspace deck jockeys or whatever we were in those books.
Whenever I see how bad like modern tech works for over a course of years, I'm like, so this is why analog sticks around in the cyberpunk futures.
Yeah,
like,
totally.
Like, why do they have an oil car? I'm like, yeah, you look around a little bit sometimes. They're like, I see why.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think this is part of why you see like the big, like there's a big boom for like analog gaming now. People buying up old CRTs. I have a friend who's got like 10 CRTs. He just collects these things, emulates on them.
The sort of like collector identity as well has sort of, because I know even when you were growing up and you were collecting, Gundams initially, right? It wasn't a culture of buy and resell or buy and I don't know, whatever. Same thing with these used cars. Like the value of these things that we used to just sort of take as part of our day-to-day life has sort of, I feel, become outsized in terms of what it actually, it's almost like a Beanie Baby craze. But
well, I mean, everybody, especially we embrace things that soothe us now more than we did back then. Like back in time, you would pour all your money into your house and your car. Yeah. But because the future was a lot more stable, I think, or at least we envisioned it that way. Now it's not. And this is another big theme of Pure Invention, which is that the fantasy delivery devices I talk about in there, whether they're toys or Hello Kitty or video games or image boards, like 4chan, which came out of a Japanese board called 2channel. These are more than just products or services. They're actually tools for navigating a kind of post-apocalyptic, late capitalist, post-industrial landscape that we're all trying to navigate right now. And the Japanese have about a 10 to 15 year lead on dealing with that kind of society and that kind of fallout.
And so I was actually going to say, because you talk about to bring it back to last that, and probably like one or two more questions so I could make sure I can not use up all your time. But the idea that like the time period of regression really helped Japan sort of insulate and sort of come up with these ideas that were futuristic and helped establish it as a cultural exporter instead of what it was maybe as a tech or hub manufacturer.
Yeah.
Now, do you see, say America's in the same parallel? Do you see maybe, I guess it's probably a little bit of a jump, but do you see a similar version coming out? Or do you think that because the culture, Japan is so unique in itself that its history helped to create that moment and the timing was right, but it just gives guideposts for America?
Well, I think, no, Japan went through and is going through things that all advanced democracies will go through. That especially as we move from being manufacturing based to kind of a post-manufacturing information based economy. And like the more educated your populace is, the less children you have. It's just a factor of education and wealth. Like most people don't want 9 kids like they had back in my dad's generation, the boomer generation. Access to contraceptives and like blah, 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 and like wanting to plan your lives more, wanting to have fun more, for all sorts of reasons. So like that decline in fertility is something that Japan has. I often trot this statistic out because it blows people's minds. Japan sells more diapers to adults than they do to babies. And not for fetishists. I know someone are gonna be like, I know people like wait a second, and that's fine. That's fine too if that's your thing. But
that's not the statistic.
That's not the statistic. It's about elderly people. And of course, and
we're
so like
towards that here as well.
And so is Europe. So is China. So is China. So like all of these kind of advanced, like the stuff Japan went through isn't weird. Like Japan's method of dealing with it might be unique because of its culture, but it barreling through this stuff is absolutely not unique. And that's a big, we love stuff from Japan because it's cool and it's fun and it's well made and all sorts of other reasons, but we also like it because it's a kind of echo from a future past. That we're just now experiencing. This is like getting into interstellar territory here, like the Christopher Nolan.
I was going to say, looking through the bookshelf.
Exactly. There's no ghost there, but there is. There's always a ghost in the shell.
Yeah.
So it's
100%. And this is why history is important, because the answer is always in there.
Yeah.
And
So
so,
it's that's like Pure Invention is a kind of love letter to all of the stuff that I loved from Japan and that we all love from Japan, and it can be read that way because like, well, how the hell did Hello Kitty come to be? Like I really wanted to know that, but it's also kind of a roadmap for dealing with the strange terrain of modern life.
yeah.
And it kind of comes down on the future was once made in Japan, but I don't think it's going to be made in Japan anymore. It's going to be made everywhere else with sensibilities that we've all borrowed from Japan, which is why you see Westerners making Japan style games or manga, or even things in the way that we consume like Korean pop music. It's of course that's Korean, but the way we consume it is really evocative of the way otaku hyper consumed Japanese idol bands in the 90s, because it's like this is what humans do when they get into this type of situation. 100%. And the actual thing you're consuming doesn't matter so much. So we're going to see a lot of this in the years to come. We're already seeing it in many ways.
The K-pop question is actually very interesting because that was going to be one of the quotes I wanted to have as well, which is you had all this focus on Japan and Japan as a cultural exporter, and the sort of through the book you realize how it was a slow buildup. It wasn't like an overnight shift.
Yes.
But it set the infrastructure up for something like the Korean cultural sort of, domination that sort of took place in the last couple of years. And so I was going to ask what you saw in that, because I know Korean culture is obviously not one-to-one, but the idea that K-pop and Korean dramas and Korean film has so quickly sort of vaulted to mainstream.
Japan certainly laid the groundwork because it made Asian stuff cool, and this is kind of tough, I think, for a lot of young people to wrap their brains around. But like in the 70s, Asia was not cool. It was seen as like the uncoolest thing in the world. And like then stuff like Chinese martial arts movies and like Japanese, like, samurai movies and then like anime and games and stuff came around and just completely flipped that script. Now it's like understood that Japan and Asia make cool stuff. So like the idea that Koreans or anybody could make awesome pop music, like the fact that they were Korean, nobody cared about by the time they're like, holy shit, these guys are just, wow, these guys are good, And so a lot of that kind of like, frankly, racist element had been deflated. So, absolutely. But I don't think like K-pop's rise means like Japan is out. It's there. I don't think anybody is making a one-to-one comparison of K-pop and J-pop and being like, I'm going to choose K-pop. You just can't hear J-pop because the music, like the rights situation is so like archaic here that for many years they blocked putting J-pop onto YouTube and stuff like that. So people couldn't even hear it. But like, the fact you see like there's a huge boom for city pop music right now without any marketing at all shows that people do like Japanese sounds. But the point of this being is that with fantasy delivery devices, like the stuff I talk about in my book, and I think BTS, it's not in the book, but K-pop's a fantasy delivery device too. 100%. Like the human imagination is unlimited. Like there's room for liking K-pop and like Demon Slayer or like Chainsaw Man or like they don't cancel each other out. So that's the great thing.
Absolutely. But that's where I was like, that's what I was curious, because I was like, I don't think it wouldn't be overlapping, right? So I couldn't imagine anime. I feel like these things are associated. So it'd be like Japanese anime wouldn't as much be competed with Korean. But why? That's why I was curious. I was like, why did the anime pop here versus Korean anime won't be as big here?
The rise of K-pop is like its own thing, and like now Korean like webtoons and stuff are
Korean
on
dramas
the rise.
Are really big as well.
Korean dramas are big. That is its own. Like, I hope somebody writes, Pure Invention : the Korean story. Do you know what I mean? Like, because it definitely needs to be told. And I think there are some books on that coming out now, but we're really in the middle of that. I don't think it can actually be written yet. I think we need to, like 10 years from now is when I want to read the book about how we got to now.
Which is why your book was, as everyone, if you're having it, please buy this, because that was a perfectly timed book, because it was multifaceted in its analysis, and that was really, and you don't really find that. You find a lot of information siloed.
Like the anime book.
The anime book, the gaming book, the World War II history book, and I was like, no, there's this loose way to describe the culture that has different elements. That how did they come together?
And I
And
love
so-
those books. I love
I
those
love
books.
those
There's great book, Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, or like the recent one about Japanese RPGs.
by
Might
what is it? Power Up.
Well, Power Up by Chris Kohler is a great one.
Because see, that's what I love. So on this little shelf at the bottom are gaming books, because I had been, and One Up by Jus Van Druden, friend of the show. What's up, Jus? It's more of a business oriented book. It's called Power Up, and it's focused on sort of economic evolution. And so that was another version. Like your book fits that mold as well, of those which has like really popular things that for some reason no one is focusing on. And I'm like, I wish someone with the resources and knowledge would just write this book. And then I stumbled upon your book, and I was like, just the right person.
Yeah, no, thank you. I really wanted to. And by the way, the book I was thinking of was Fight Magic Items by Aidan Moher. Or Mower, I think his name is pronounced. What's that?
I'm gonna write that one down.
It's a fun one. That's actually about interviews with behind the scenes looks into like the development of a lot of like key Japanese RPG games. You should have him on. He's a great guy. But yeah, I wanted to write a book that like people are into Japan usually not for just one thing. Like you're usually not just like a ravenous Hello Kitty fan. You're into that as part of like, but you also like Japanese music, and you also like Japanese games and anime and manga and cosplay. Yeah. And like there just wasn't anything out there that kind of tied them all together. Yeah. And so that was what I wanted to do, is like kind of do a more holistic, like a big picture of view, because it's multifaceted. Like you said, it's not just one siloed thing. So, but I do love books that do deep dives on single topics. Those books are amazing stuff. So,
and it's great when someone takes like 7 of those and puts them together in an overarching narrative.
Well, thank you for reading. I really appreciate it. And the book's available at regular bookstores. It's available on like Amazon, whatever. It's a major mainstream release. So
link is in the description. Go buy it. It's great. And we look forward to seeing what you write next. Are you already thinking about book 2?
Oh, yes, I am. Of course I am. It's going to be a while, though. Right now, I'm actually helping out my wife, Hiroko, who is writing a book that's not like Pure Invention, but it's more focused on reconnecting with Japanese spiritual traditions. So I've been really helping her with that, because those spiritual traditions underlie a lot of the things we like about Japanese pop culture, too. We just don't think about it. So stay tuned. When that's ready to go, I'm sure I'll be, helping her do podcasts and things like that. So
absolutely. I have a book recommendation on the topic that might be helpful.
Please.
It's by Caitlin Dowdy. She's an author. It's called Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. I forget the second book. She just wrote a sequel as well, but
I'll check it out.
It's just about the practices and culture of death, and that sort of connects. And so it talks about how Japan deals with the culture with death and the sort of practices associated with. So
this looks interesting.
Practice. Yeah,
I'll check it out.
Worth checking out. Yeah,
I'll check it out. Well, thanks for the tip. It's always good to get tips from situations like this. But thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on again, and hopefully look forward to having you on in the future again. It was a great convo.
Anytime. Always talk about games and stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And so
thank you.
We'll be back, folks.